Hello and welcome to the fifth session of the concept of acceleration. I'm going to pass the mic off to Nick Land right now.
Thanks, Theo, and thanks everyone for being here. As I was just saying to people, I think that I'm thinking of this as being the first of a 2-week block on the trough phase of our current contemporary wave of accelerationist thinking, and dealing explicitly with stagnationist notions, which I think it surely fairly uncontroversially just click onto our topic. If there does seem to be any doubt about that, I hope I can draw people into it within the next 20 minutes or so. And it turns out really, I think that 2011 was this crucial year. I mean, I'm looking at the material that we've got here, and it's all 2011. Tyler Cohen's The Great Stagnation book, the Peter Thiel piece called The End of the Future that I'm going to mainly concentrate on, a few little bits and pieces around that. There's a sort of preliminary sort of philosophical question that I'm not trying to close, but just recall in anticipation of it, which is the whole structure. We can talk about it in very different ways. Most simply, the fact value distinction, whether we're talking about descriptive or prescriptive language, how robust that distinction is, how accelerationism complicates and perhaps even in certain sense dismantles, certainly diagonalizes it. And I think that we have to just revisit those questions a little bit in talking about this stagnationist topic. Obviously, accelerate the process is not a theoretical strict description, even if it draws upon one. It's a slogan, an imperative maxim, a perlocutionary speech act, or an order word. It's actually something much more like an instruction than a theoretical analysis. And since this 3-word phrase constitutes the inalienable nuclear core of the accelerationist canon, it is understandable that accelerationism should be conceived as a program or prescription. And I think we have to say such a conception cannot be simply wrong. However we want to complicate it, I don't think it's simply dismissible. And the reason to raise that now, at this point, is that if we were approaching from the other side and we were saying with equal naivety perhaps that accelerationism was fundamentally a form of theoretical description, then we'd be tempted to say surely that stagnation is almost sufficient as a refutation of the accelerationist thesis. There's a certain naive construction of accelerationism of something like a kind of historical theory in the scientific mode that would simply predict the absence of stagnation and therefore the emergence of this stagnationist issue would look like something like an intrinsic argument against accelerationism understood in that sense. I don't think anything like that is going on. I think that there's a far more fertile relation between the two, and I think even though accelerationism and stagnationism seem at a certain level to be terms that are simply opposed to each other, they're actually in an extremely vibrant, dynamic relationship with each other, feed into each other so tightly that actually they become, at certain points, almost indistinguishable, and they serve to rehearse and reproduce a lot of the questions that we've been sort of creeping our way into in the previous 4 weeks. So I think it's utterly banal and uncontroversial to the point of banality to say that the financial crisis of 2008 ushered in something like a stagnationist moment. And I think it's also clear that what we've already seen of the left accelerationist canon is deeply connected with this. You could say, you can read it in a certain way as almost an element of this stagnationist moment, or perhaps even a symptom of it, if one was going to be condescending, which of course we'll try not to be. And the crucial left accelerationist thesis in this respect is that capital is the intrinsic cause of its own underperformance, that this is something to come back to. And, you know, the only reason for making or support for such a thesis is the fact that we have some significant evidence of underperformance to deal with. So just one last sort of back tread on this, which is sort of covering things that we've already talked about. And that's to say, I hope we've seen already that there is an intellectual, historical, and philosophical case for complicating the notions of left and right accelerationism. But just as with the case of these teleological, mechanistic notions, fact and value, these distinctions used crudely, I think these terms still take us quite a long way and bring us into the topic quite helpfully. And there is a gloss that very basic and, you know, ultimately to be probed with some extra sophistication, but very crudely, I think that left and right accelerationism can be glossed as being the socialist and libertarian strains of accelerationist thinking, respectively. And so still more roughly, but also more philosophically, the question being, does the underperformance of capitalism in its own terms have an immanent or a transcendent cause? So this question, just to work around it a little bit, there's obviously a large number of ways of questioning capitalism that take us right outside of that question and would oppose the very notion of growth, perhaps the very notion of technology or technological explosion, that would say that the super performance of capitalism in its own terms as techno-economic explosive growth is itself a pathological historical process to be criticized from outside. But I think as soon as we're in the accelerationist space, that isn't our problem. That's not what anyone is saying. It's rather that even if we accept the metrics capitalism places for itself, or at least some of them, and for instance, most unproblematically in terms of this dispute, take maximally accelerated technological progress as being a criterion accepted across the whole spectrum, then the question dividing left and right is whether this is something that capitalism consistently promotes, or as the right accelerationist position I think would have to assert, or from the left accelerationist position, does capitalism become inhibitory in relation to this process of technological expansion? And while by no means claiming to have thoroughly absorbed the left accelerationist arguments about this. I think at least we've visited them and have some sense of what they're saying. So I think this week is an opportunity to look at what the more libertarian aspect on accelerationism looks like. And I think it comes into extremely stark relief, perhaps a little ironically, perhaps not, in this whole stagnationist moment. So I think the text, Adam provided a much wider and more expansive reading list that I think everybody has seen already. I would contend that the basic text of this, looking back of this question of stagnation, is Tyler Cohen's book, The Great Stagnation, which was published in January 2011. I'm not going to get hugely into it now, because I want to mainly move on to Peter Thiel's argument. Perhaps we can look at it, his arguments more closely, either later today or down the road a little bit. But I would like to quote a remark by Peter Boettger on his blog Coordination Problem about Cohen's book, which I'll put in the sidebar. Because I think that it is extremely relevant to this, to a sense of what the right accelerationist or more libertarian case, that's to say, of a transcendent rather than immanent obstacle to continuous capitalistic explosive growth looks like. And so Boettger says, Cohen is a cultural optimist, a champion of the free trade in ideas, goods, services, and all artifacts of mankind. But he is also an economic realist in the age of economic illusion. What do I mean by the economics of illusion? Government policies since World War II have created an illusion that irresponsible fiscal policy, the manipulation of money and credit, and expansion of the regulation of the economy is consistent with rising standards of living. This was made possible because of the low-hanging technological fruit that Cohen identifies as being plucked in the 19th and early 20th centuries in the US, and in spite of the government policies pursued. An accumulated economic surplus was created by the age of innovation, which the age of economic illusions spent down. We are now coming to the end of that accumulated surplus, and thus the full weight of government inefficiencies are starting to be felt throughout the economy. Our politicians promise too much, our government spends too much in an apparent chase after the promises made, and our population has come to be accustomed, I'm adding, there's a glitch in his text, has come to be accustomed to both government guarantees and government largesse. So obviously what Boettger is saying here is that rather than, as the most classical reading of Marx would have it, and I think it then continues throughout the socialist tradition, that government within capitalist modernity is functional for capitalism, broadly speaking. We're seeing something much more, the libertarian case is much more that government in this period is compensatory in relation to, and at a certain point actually it threatens to significantly cancel the capitalist dynamic, and thus leads to this kind of crisis that, as we've seen, has a very different sense in these two sort of ideological camps, these two political camps. So then we come to Peter Thiel. Now, his essays also, it's from October 2011, so it's not much later. It's basically there's just a very compact wave of this kind of material happening in 2011, and he, I think, has some connected but distinct ideas about what is causing the great stagnation to Tyler Cohen. But both of them share quite a lot. They both share the fact that they understand capitalistic growth as being driven by these fundamental waves of technological innovation, by the fundamental technologies. And, well, I think it's better to quote Thiel a little bit. He says, first of all, progress is neither automatic nor mechanistic. It is rare. Indeed, the unique history of the West proves the exception to the rule that most human beings through the millennia have existed in a naturally brutal, unchanging, and impoverished state. But there is no law that the exceptional rise of the West must continue. So we could do worse than to inquire into the widely held opinion that America is on the wrong track and has been for some time, to wonder whether progress is not doing as well as advertised, and perhaps to take exceptional measures to arrest and reverse the decline. Now, he's a little bit evasive in this essay about exactly what this derailing looks like in terms of policy terms. It's not his central goal here to deal with that. But I think it's quite clear in terms of what he says about money. Maybe I should even just try and quickly find that. Sorry, 1 second. Yes, he says, the most common name for misplaced emphasis on macroeconomic policy is Keynesianism. Despite his brilliance, John Maynard Keynes was always a bit of a fraud, and there was always a bit of clever trickery and massive fiscal stimulus and the related printing of paper money. But we must acknowledge that this fraud strangely seemed to work for many decades. The great scientific and technological tailwind of the 20th century powered many economically delusional ideas. Even during the Great Depression of the 1930s, innovation expanded new and emerging fields as diverse as radio, movies, aeronautics, household appliances, polymer chemistry, and secondary oil recovery. In spite of their many mistakes, the New Dealers pushed technological innovation very hard. So, I mean, this sort of emphasis on the Keynesian New Deal compact as being inherently contrary to the maximal prolongation of capitalist dynamics. I think it looks very Austrian. It's very classically libertarian in emphasis. And I think it would be hard to say that that kind of thing isn't going on behind Thiel's argument, even though his own ideas are very distinct from classical Austrian analysis in certain respects. He certainly seems to be suggesting that if we're looking for the processes that's taken us into the great stagnation in the deepest sense, it's a lot to do with the expansive role of government in the economy and the takeover of the financial and monetary system, in particular by government. I'll just do another couple of little Thiel quotes from the same essay. he says, when tracked against the admittedly lofty hopes of the 1950s and 1960s, technological progress has fallen short in many domains. Consider the most literal instance of non-acceleration. We are no longer moving faster. The centuries-long acceleration of travel speeds from ever faster sailing ships in the 16th or 18th centuries, the advent of ever faster roads in the 19th century, and ever faster cars and airplanes in the 20th century, reversed with the decommissioning of the Concorde in 2003, to say nothing of the nightmarish delays caused by strikingly low-tech post-9/11 airport security systems. Today's advocates of space jets, lunar vacations, and the manned exploration of the solar system appear to hail from another planet. Now, there's lots of things that could be said about this paragraph. My interest in it particularly is how it really locks onto the MAP, which actually is written 2 years later, in this question of speed, and the fact that the move that Thiel makes from in this thing, consider the most literal instance of non-acceleration, it weirdly sort of mirrors and echoes this move made in the MAP for saying, oh, right accelerationism simply confuses acceleration with speed. I think mere brain dead speed, I think, is the exact quote. We shouldn't perhaps get completely lost back in this question again, but obviously Thiel is saying that the collapse of actual transport velocity is a relevant index of what he sees as this deceleration process into profound stagnation. And one more quote from him, which I think is very important for the contemporary relevance of this. Like, this is 2011, so it's basically 5 years before the Trumpocalypse, but it, I think, gives some weird preliminary reverberations in relation to that, where he says, the technology slowdown threatens not just our financial markets, but the entire modern political order, which is predicated on easy and relentless growth. The give and take of Western democracies depends on the idea that we can craft political solutions that enable most people to win most of the time. But in a world without growth, we can expect a loser for every winner. Many will suspect that the winners are involved in some sort of racket, so we can expect an increasingly nasty edge to our politics. We may be witnessing the beginnings of such a zero-sum system in politics in the US and Western Europe, as the risks shift from winning less to losing more, and as our leaders desperately cast about for macroeconomic solutions to problems that have not been primarily about economics for a long time. So I think that even people really not at all coming from where Thiel is coming from, and deeply suspicious about his agenda, would be hard pressed not to see a certain prophetic element in that paragraph. You know, as a one paragraph introduction to the kind of place we've come to, I think it would be hard to beat. And obviously there's very different interpretations of, as we've seen, of what the sources of this growth deficit might be. Considerable cross-partisan agreement about their consequences, and the fact that we're seeing some of those consequences playing themselves out in our contemporary political environment. I think I'm tempted at this point to do my usual sort of backing off thing and just seeing whether we're already in a position to to talk about this outside monologue mode. I'd obviously like to thank, it's Zach who pushed us onto this, and I think it was extremely helpful thing to do.
I'm not sure it's going to add much, but in the Peter Thiel talks in the extracts you sent us, he also links, I think, the idea of stagnation to a kind of horizontality,
right? Yes,
which is missing in the examples, the paragraphs you've just quoted, but I think it's quite explicitly related to a kind of globalizing horizontal movement, yes, of capital and technological development.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know what more to say about that, but
no, but that's a great thing, actually, Derek. I'm sorry, if you have more to say, don't let me interrupt.
No, I haven't at the moment.
But if you haven't, let me just jump off just for a couple of minutes on that, because I haven't really obviously touched upon what Thiel's specific ideas are, and I've mostly just been using him as an emblem of this kind of libertarian oblique line into our questions about acceleration. But I think but what you're saying, I think, does provoke some attempt, at least in a nutshell, to talk about Thiel's ideas very, very quickly, because you're absolutely right that he draws this big distinction between the horizontal and vertical axis. And now, obviously, this language, again, has these echoes in left accelerationism, but I think they're very distinct. If people think they can join these two vocabularies up together, then that would be great. I think it's just a kind of chance echo rather than anything more substantial at the moment. Because for Thiel, it seems almost everything comes from his reading of René Girard. And it's a really fascinating, he really does do something interesting and important with Girard. I think draws things out of it that were not seen before. And again, super in a nutshell, Girard's basic thesis is that there is this anthropological structure that is organized by what he calls mimetic desire. That's to say that what is desired is the object of desire of the other, always. So it's basically that the value of any object is how much it's valued by other people, and that this has an intrinsic contagious dynamic to it that sort of spreads across the social field. It has a kind of this is not a language that Peter Thiel himself makes big advantage of it, but it has a kind of positive feedback structure to it, because the more people invest in particular objects of desire, the more those objects of desire are valorized throughout the social field and trigger more and more and more of this, what Girard calls mimetic desire. And there's a kind of Christian twist in Girard that Thiel follows up on too, which is that he interprets the Christian religion in terms of this deeper process of sacrifice, where the only way that this kind of process of amplification, of mimetic amplification, is actually short-circuited and sort of restored back to some kind of ground state, is through an act of sacrifice, of some scapegoat who stands in for the for the sorry, I've just lost the right word here. For I could probably be stuck on this for half an hour, so I better just jump over it. The process of social hostility that is intrinsic in this spread of mimetic desire requires this act of violence that can be concentrated in this symbolic, iconic form in the figure of a scapegoat or sacrifice, and therefore acts as this kind of abreaction that restores social equilibrium. So there's this whole set of relations involved that involves this notion that the whole thing climaxes in some kind of sacrifice, in a way, sacrifice of the king, as it would be in Fraser's In a Golden Bough type of construction. That's, I think, very big for Girard, and obviously in the Christian Passion there's a similar model of this. And so this is horizontality for Thiel, and he says, look, isn't this what globalization, understood as this horizontal process of competitive market economics, mimetic desire, consumerism, advertising, this construction of this horizontal plane of coordinated desire in terms of these particular consumer lures that are sort of amplified in a way by advertising and but more importantly by this horizontal dynamic itself, this social dynamic that spreads out across the whole world. And everything about this dynamic he's deeply suspicious about, because he thinks it does lead to this escalation of violence that requires some act of sacrifice. And there's all kind of fallout in all kinds of direction from this analysis. One of them is that in radical departure from the kind of Austrian mainstream of libertarian thinking, he thinks competitive economics are disastrous. He doesn't, competitive free markets for Thiel are constantly read in this Girard framework that makes him think that they are these motors of this escalating social violence leading to some kind of crisis. And so verticality for him is something that escapes this axis of mimetic desire and violence at a complete perpendicular. And this is what his 0 to 1 book is about. That the 0 to 1 movement for him is this movement of that takes you completely out of this competitive field. It takes you from the non-existence of some
Hey Nick, we just lost you for a little bit.
The whole thing is not, to say about this extremely short and scrappy. Maybe people want to come back to it, but as a take onto some of the weird themes of the kind of European program, intriguing. Like if you say, well, economic nationalism and the attempt to kind of retreat the slightest amount of libertarian to propound, and without wanting to, I think there's a whole lot of complicated things around this.
Hey Nick,
but one, this.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. There's just quite a bit of lag, I think. Can you hear me?
Sorry, Theo, have I got some connection problem?
Okay, I think Nick's just going to log out and try and come back in. Just 1 minute. Hi, Nick. Can you hear us?
Yeah, sorry guys, I don't know what that was about. I just lost Google Hangouts completely.
Okay, I think that it seems like you're a little bit clearer now. Do you want to? It looks like maybe we lost you for like 2 minutes before you.
Okay. Okay. Well, anyway, look, there's no need for me to particularly press this very much. I don't want to interrupt, but it's just to say that optic onto what this Trumpian. If you're asking, well, what on earth could TLC in this Trump program? You know, wouldn't it be against his kind of libertarian impulses? And you can see that perhaps that there's this about the attempt to this axis of horizontality, you know, that axis of globalism, market competition, untrammeled, sweeping, ever expanded mimetic desire, and return, or at least to emphasize instead this axis of verticality to do with technological innovation of a radical kind, without, you know, that's monopolistic intrinsically. No, it's not monopolistic because it's produced a competitive situation. It's monopolistic because it's totally originary and therefore without initial competition. And there does seem to be this kind of solidarity that at least you can see how he might see that kind of break as something he can work with, and that might be in keeping with his ideas, particularly, as I say, outlined in this 0 to 1 book, but I think more generally part of his kind of intellectual formation in general. So all of that just to say Derek's totally right, I think, to introduce this question of horizontality. It's a huge issue for Thiel, and I think it does a lot of work in this framework.
Hi, do you think Thiel has any connection to NRX?
Well, I think to say he had none would be a stretch. I mean, because Thiel's essay on the education of a libertarian, done in this 2009 Cato colloquium, was, I think, very influential. So that's just one intellectual link. I mean, obviously, this very famous sentence in where he's saying, I no longer can see democracy and liberty as compatible, I think was almost a kind of mantra for the initial initial wave of NRX. And then there might be other issues. I think they're complicated. I mean, you know, it's very easy to get into conspiracy theories about this. I'm at a huge distance from it, even though I get brought into these conspiracy theories. I'm generally, sadly, out of the loop. You know, I'm not in America. I don't know these Silicon Valley guys. I've never had any communication with Peter Thiel at all. But whether Peter Thiel and Curtis Yarvin have some communication, I suspect they're not utter strangers to each other, and I don't know what they think of each other's ideas, but at least there's a question there. So I think there's some room for interesting Machiavellian analysis, but it does slide very quickly into kind of wild, delirious conspiracy theorizing, and so it's a complicated tightrope to walk.
And I'm not wholly sure. I think if there's a definite connection between yourself and Moldbug, then you could make the argument that there is definitely a clear-cut one between him and Peter Thiel.
Well, my relation to Moldbug is that I mention him, and there has been a tiny amount of like encrypted blog commentary back and forth. But I mean, I've never spoken to him, and we've, you know, so it's an extremely tenuous relation on that level of social connection. It's a one-way philosophical connection, I think, more than anything else. So I don't know, but you know, you can perhaps draw a two. I mean, obviously, I would be very flattered by the notion of any of these two-stage removed connections to Peter Thiel. I find him an absolutely fascinating person, even though I'm not always in full agreement with his ideas. I'm always interested in them and enriched by them, I would say, maybe.
To throw out maybe a provocative statement that people could respond to, perhaps. I mean, it seems to me, my reading of Peter Thiel, he's almost on the spectrum of accelerationism. I mean, you could pretty easily peg him as this left accelerationist type in a couple different ways. I mean, I'm thinking of the statement from the MAP, basically, what was it, like the future must be created, or they said it more eloquently. But, you know, in a nutshell, that's almost Peter Thiel's entire shtick the last few years. Like this non-deterministic conception of the future. No, I'll leave it there rather than rambling.
Okay, I thought you were going to make two, though. Have I missed one? I mean, that's a good point. Am I missing two parts to that, or is there another one still to come?
I'm actually kind of curious to see what Vincent might have to say, since he agrees. And
yeah, can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So it reminds me of something that actually Nick says in his article on teleoplexy. Nick, you mentioned this possibility of investing the state with a kind of tactical accelerationism. And it seems to me that Thiel is almost trying to do the same sort of thing, that you would need these kind of palpitations almost of developmentalism in order to get the kind of vertical progress that you need beyond the multiplication of globalization. So it seems that there is possibly a way you can read Thiel as a left accelerationist in a weird way.
Right. I mean, this is interesting. I've sort of trapped myself in a bit of a box here because the way I've defined the essential claim of left accelerationism, that the cause of capitalist stagnation is intrinsic to capital itself. And I think that in that respect, it would be hard to make the claim that Thiel was a left accelerationist because of the fact that he's redefining capitalism, but he's definitely making this 0 to 1 movement something that he wants to put at the very heart of capitalism. And in a way, he's trying to, in his own terms, he wants to rescue capitalism from what he sees as the mimetic entropy of free markets. I mean, it's a weirdly interesting, in terms of the thing that I've been used to, coming out of Brodel and this whole notion of sort of a kind of free market anti-capitalism model that you get in a certain relation to Deleuze and Guattari, and coming out of Brodel's historical work. Thiel just seems to invert that and accepts the separability of markets and capitalism, and says that markets are basically there to wreck capitalism, and he wants to save capitalism from free markets, which is a kind of really I won't say off left field because that would be confusing in this context, but it's a real out of the blue, oblique kind of a move to make, I think. But having said that, yes, I don't know what to make about the claim there. I mean, you see, what do you think Thiel expects from the state? If you let's try and construct a certain kind of model of like Thiel, the Machiavellian genius who really has close, access to Trump's ear and to the inner workings of the administration and can push it in certain directions. What do you think it is that he would want the state to do?
I mean, practically, I guess for him, it's a question of diverting the resources available to the state away from things like welfare or whatever into these big projects, which seems to be kind of
right.
What it's not the analysis of left accelerationism, and that I agree with you completely on that, but it seems to be what they kind of implicitly want as their praxis. They define it as marrying the network and the plan, which I think oddly is similar to what Thiel wants to do. He wants to have some kind of central kind of redirection of resources towards something which is more productive, i.e. that there's some kind of idea of a plan going on, but it's done via the network of the market.
Right. Yes, I mean, he does. And I'm trying to think where I've just seen that. Was that actually in his essay where he says, I think there's a quote that just is really very relevant to what you've just said. Yes, sorry, can I just read a little bit of this Thiel thing, which I think is it ties up with your point here, Vincent, very, very tightly. He says, in practice, we all sense that such gloating, that is, I probably need, about the success of the Manhattan Project and these big state-directed technological enterprises, belongs to a very different time. Most of our political leaders are not engineers or scientists and do not listen to engineers or scientists. Today, a letter from Einstein would get lost in the White House mailroom and the Manhattan Project would not even get started. It certainly could never be complete in 3 years. And then I think most crucially, I am not aware of a single political leader in the US, either Democrat or Republican, who would cut healthcare spending in order to free up money for biotechnology research, or more generally, who would make serious cuts to the welfare state in order to free up serious money for major engineering projects. So that does seem to be very much in tune with the analysis that you were making. And it does, yes, it does have an interesting relation to left accelerationism, for sure. It would be an interesting thing to put to them. I mean, I don't know whether, Karim's willing to stand in as a kind of spokesperson for left accelerationism and respond to that suggestion and how it fits.
I don't know. I just think that what you just said, or I forget who pointed out that when you ask the question of what would Thiel want with the state, I believe that it's principally right ends and goals. I think that in his mind, destruction of the, say, welfare state and destruction of democracy as is, and saying that it's an obstruction to true freedom is ostensibly an extension of right-wing principles.
Well, I mean, it is for him, but my point, I guess, is that if you bracket away the ideological background, then what you're left with is a praxis that looks very much like some kind of state-led development process. And of course, you're right that it's not left-wing, but then in a sense, this is a problem that left accelerationism has to deal with, because that is what the rigorous form of their praxis looks like, in my opinion. It looks something like the East Asian developmental state, for example, I think.
I'm just saying I don't think you can bracket it away like that. I think you have to situate what people think in terms of ideology along with
Intentionality.
Yeah, intentionality, and him being situated so close to Moldbug and obviously Trump makes me see his ideology as praxis as in a particular way. Specifically since he has so much capital and is in a position to make so many decisions. It's the only way that I think it is plausible.
Well, yes, of course, but I guess the point here is that things never work out the way that people want them to. It may very well be, and it is, of course, true that Thiel has some kind of right-wing background, but that doesn't have to mean that what he's proposing is some kind of inherently right-wing thing. This is why I keep bringing it back to this question of developmentalism, because you look at Park Chung-hee in South Korea, which is, I'm publishing an article on him at the moment, but Park Chung-hee had this very kind of peculiar, basically, understanding that he drew from Japanese fascism, and he wanted to construct a kind of fascist state. What he ended up doing was catapulting South Korea to becoming a developed nation, essentially the fastest growth in the history of the planet. But his actual project basically became irrelevant. After he died, it collapsed. South Korea became a developed nation, but then the developmentalist project kind of obsolesced itself. That's kind of what I see might happen if you carry out this 0 to 1 praxis, is that you get the 0 to 1 moment, and then that whole ideological network, then, okay, its project is accomplished, and then it decays, and its kind of historical function is fulfilled. That's what I think happens, basically.
I mean, I guess there's a whole sort of construction of American political and economic history that would see that as some kind of repetitive wave-like motion. I mean, if you were to say, you're obviously very far from a kind of standard Austrian economic viewpoint in saying this, but, starting with Hamiltonianism, a certain sense of the usage of the American state in pushing forward technologies like the telegraph and the railroads, and this sense of the state as a driver of infrastructure projects in order to catalyze this techno-economic circuitry. If you have this Promethean sense of politics as a kind of technological driver, then I guess you would constantly see these waves of progress and relapse of the kind that you've just said you see in Korea. And maybe there is a reading of what Thiel's saying in this piece that is not a million miles from that insofar as it succeeds, it produces an economic surplus, that economic surplus is then haggled over by kind of redistributionist democratic politics. It's basically absorbed through that process, stripped out of its role as being a kind of technological driver, and then you reach some sort of stagnationist period that requires some kind of reboot, some actual crisis that allows you to redirect the social surplus back into this kind of direction of infrastructure and technological stimulation.
Which is also Marx's point about the waves, about the fact that you have these waves of progress and relapse, and that you need some kind of occasional crisis, which then for him resets the rate of profit. I think there's an interesting analogy here between Marx and right-wing kinds of developmentalism.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, you know, what is the, is there a story on the left accelerationist side about how the trade-off between infrastructure, let's put it as crudely as possible, infrastructure and welfare spending is to be negotiated, you know, because it surely can't be the case that we can just say, you know, it's all a kind of happy win-win, there are no trade-offs, you know, we get our universal basic income, we get lots of government-directed technological process, we can have it all, and there's, you know, there's none of this zero-sum nastiness, there's no sort of conflict over resource allocation to worry us. I mean, that seems to me just pure utopianism. I mean, open to an argument against it, but I can't see how that can be a consistent or persuasive persuasive position. So it does require some story about how the kind of government infrastructure spending is not going to be bled off into these forms of welfare consumption.
I mean, maybe it would come from higher taxes on businesses and the wealthy. I don't really know. I don't know what the details would be, but
but even that, if you expand the pool, all well and good. I mean, but there's the question of the internal. I mean, look, there's a little story kind of beginning to emerge here of a certain kind of Promethean statism that is peculiarly ambivalent between you know, a certain construction of right accelerationism and left accelerationism, and that Promethean statism is faced by this kind of rhythmic historical tragedy of the bleeding off of infrastructural investment spending, its kind of technological promotion role into redistributive welfare politics. So I don't think that you can't sort of resolve a tragedy of that basic by simply saying, well, there's kind of untapped resources outside that we can just suck in and you know, displace this forever. I mean, that seems to me really unpersuasive, especially if, you know, the untapped economy is partly a kind of cybernetic function of the efficacy of this infrastructural technological stimulation, and you know, where we're starting with this whole question about stagnationism is a situation where there's been a failure of radical technological innovation leading to this cascading stagnationary syndrome across the economy that precisely, you know, removes the possibility of milking up free, untapped economic resources from somewhere outside, I think.
I almost think the question could even be framed like, without government in the picture, and relate a couple ways back to this course, i.e., you know, what happens to take any kind of like redistribution out of it, but like just plain consumption in the marketplace and consumptive buying, and how that relates to moving capital away from savings, i.e. investment, and how it all filters back around. I mean, I'm thinking about it in the context of kind of where we left things last week in terms of like the teleology of capital and how that might not work without kind of human consumption, right at the center of wherever you start that diagram.
Right. Yes, I mean, we're coming at a very different angle, but I agree it totally connects. And Thiel's skepticism about the market, as seeing it as instead as this kind of horizontal plane of mimetic rivalry and conflict, sort of escalating to some kind of crisis, obviously does link up with this other kind of formation that we've come at in another direction. I mean, consumerism. Thiel makes a very clean break, I think, from this, which is in itself refreshing. I mean, it's intrinsically, you have to actually add things to his story to make it a consumerist account. And I think his sense of consumerism is in this sense tragic, and even in this grandiose Christian kind of metaphysical sense tragic. One other twist of this that I saw in one of the kind of, there's a whole set of quite interesting journalism pieces on Thiel and Girard and mimetic desire, and one of them at least even suggested that his own sense of Trump is as this sacrificial king, that I'm not going to say because it would be too crazily provocative or whatever, that he's seeing Trump as a Jesus, a Christ-like figure to be sort of sacrificed to appease this process of mimetic desire. That would be maybe too provocative, but he certainly, it was suggested in this article, kind of sees this kind of growing tension to this point of necessary collective sacrifice of some iconic figure, and that perhaps the role of Trump is to be this kind of Fraser's sacrificed king. So I thought that was definitely interesting.
This is a little orthogonal, and I'm not sure, where it comes in relating to, accelerationist politics as we've been discussing them. But just like for the sake of, if we're considering, stagnation, or this period of stagnation as sort of an empirical problem that, to understand its relationship to capitalism, we kind of want to consider other factors going into it. And Thiel sort of mentions that, the last time globalization contracted, it was the World Wars. And so I was sort of talking about in the sidebar that, the wartime economy is one of the most extensive and great examples of this, where, a huge chunk of the American economy was just rapidly converted and converted by public control, on a temporary massive investment basis, goal-oriented, et cetera. And in the wake of, that bought us decades of prosperity as well. A lot of technological innovation came out of it. Nuclear weapons lead to the ability to have, Keynesian mass spending, all of that sort of thing. Even Europe is laid waste to, but then the Marshall Plan comes in sort of like, the middle class after the Black Plague, and you get stuff coming out of that. And so if what we're looking at is partially that because nuclear weapons have made the Great Land Wars impossible and have diverted or have sort of like trapped military technological innovation and spending within this loop where it's just feeding into itself, growing into a complex, built better and better and better jets, is it just absolutely necessary that in this particular phase of stagnation, and that is due to a lack of this and contraction away from globalization, do we need to have some equivalent of a World War II and of the kind, at bare minimum, to get the to get the state to be involved in a process of acceleration in some meaningful way at this juncture? Do we need something like a war? And if a great war is now impossible, then what are our alternatives? And is that kind of a right-left question?
Yes. I don't know. It's interesting for sure and complicated. I mean, there's different ways you could approach that. Yeah, I mean, I just see whether other people have things to say rather before responding to it.
I think I have a really stupid question, actually. Are there other organizations or technologies that are trying to divert crises of capital other than state powers? I know that is really, really vague and stupid.
Well, no, yeah, when you say divert them, I mean, the sort of standard, obviously Austro-libertarian kind of notion of this is that if you're going to divert all this spending, you want to divert it directly back into the private sector and reclaim it to the private sector by sort of slashing state expenditure generally. So I don't know whether that counts. You know, what's sort of obviously interesting about where we are now in this discussion and this whole issue of this, the role of the Promethean developmental state, is the fact that the tension isn't on these classic lines. It's not about actually stripping money out of government and returning it to the private sector directly, but by reorienting state expenditure back towards these hard infrastructural techno goals rather than to welfarist redistribution, which I take as a proxy for into political goals. You know, like if you're cynical about the state, and maybe there are people who want to defend a notion of the altruistic state, but if you don't accept that, then obviously this entitlement spending is about political positioning. You know, it's the use of state resources for political advantage, and that would be the dynamic. That depending on which axis you're on, which of these, you know, for one, that dynamic is simply one to do with state expansion and the sucking of resources out of the private sector into government. That's something close to the Peter Burke quote that we started off with. But it seems like whether or not Thiel can be identified with this, there's something emerging in the discussion of him that is quite different and is to do with a kind of a tension within the state from this role, from this kind of heroic role of the developmental state to a kind of degenerate role as the political state whose actions are totally governed by the sort of logic of the electoral popularity contest and is diverting all its resources into winning direct public acceptance through some kind of entitlement process rather than indirectly through infrastructure innovation, technological promotion. But sorry, I feel I've just dropped Jake's point a little bit on this. Like, I mean, you see, one point on this, Jake, is like, okay, Cohen, who we haven't really been focused on particularly, but I think that Thiel, in a less direct way, says the same thing here. Sees that, you know, the economy and its growth rates and dynamics and all of these things out of the exploitation of these fundamental technologies. And now, actually, I should be more on the ball on this, because Cohen has a very definite list where he says, you know, these are the fundamental technologies of these particular epochs. things like, for instance, steam locomotion. He says the only one, the reason that we have a great stagnation at the moment partly is because we only have one. The previous epochs of growth had at least 2 or 3 of these fundamental drivers going on simultaneously. Electrification and the automobile simultaneously, for instance, whereas now everything is information technology, is his argument. That's the only sort of economically significant major technological driver of recent decades. And so the question to plug it onto your point is like, what is the story of military technology when it's related to this? Because what is the military technology? Okay, yes, it had a huge role in computing. But we've agreed that that's there anyway. Rocketry. Well, what has rocketry done? I mean, it's maybe starting to get interesting now. But I don't think even in 2011 it would have been possible for even the most optimistic booster to say that rocket technology had been a big economic driver of post-war societies. And then you're on to, I mean, I suppose, yeah, maybe the jet engine gets counted as a military technology. I don't know. It's a genuine question for me. Nuclear power, perhaps.
Yeah, no, nuclear power, I think, is definitely the kind of counterexample you're sort of referring to. Like, definitely, if that's one of the biggest, or the technologies that had the biggest economic potential coming out of that were clearly wartime developments, that would be one of them. And it ever since 3 Mile Island, that hasn't been happening at all. What was I going to say? But I mean,
yeah.
So the technological issue, I think, is the weakest, other than the computer connection thing coming out of it. But like, I mean, one thing was that the bomb making, the huge amount of chemical plant that was produced during the war, all of that was converted over to agricultural production afterwards, and that was like, agricultural fertilizer production. And that was like worldwide and used sort of like the U.S. penetration via the World War into the, it had a early globalization aspect, and also the sort of, I guess, pumping cheap. I don't actually know if pumping cheap fertilizer into the American heartland was part of us becoming the breadbasket of the world, but it wouldn't surprise me. It was the origin of Monsanto, for example, which is another one of these sort of worldwide global. And I guess like what the implication of what you're saying is that the war was maybe the path dependency of this first phase of capitalism blooming and stagnating, or whatever, rather than being like an independent cause, I guess, an independent cause of the stagnation that we have to like screen out. It's more a path dependency in the process of this technology that started in the 19th century, sort of blooming and ossifying.
Yes, I mean it's a genuinely interesting question for sure. I guess if we take it back to this thing that several people have been raising, I think in a really interesting way, and we're on the kind of left-right accelerationism fissure here in a really intriguing way about what is actually sort of immanent and transcendent in relation to the dynamic of capitalism, or I'm taking that as a synonym for techno-capitalism, but it's a conflicted term, as we see immediately. So from the classic right side of that, the dynamic of capitalism is so intrinsically technological that you would expect, the default expectation would be that these technological drivers would be immanent. And just very, very crudely, you'd say, as I think Marx fully would be in this camp. This is one of the points that I think he would skew very strongly to the right end of things, is that the dynamic of industrial mechanization has a completely intrinsic capitalistic program to it, which is to say that your variable capital outflow in terms of wages is your major competitive cost, and technology therefore is automatically directed towards the substitution of wage labor activities with machinery. So, you know, and there's obviously, you can construct this technological lineage as this series of substitutions of technological systems for human work processes, you know, and the standard discussions about Luddism and industrialization and the whole way the kind of textile industry sort of steadily went through this series of mechanical things, throwing various types of skilled textile labor. All of that stuff would fit that story, I think, very well. But what's interesting here is that when you introduce this military factor, that I'm not at all wanting to dismiss, because I think it is very persuasive in an interesting way, but you are tending to skew over then to the left accelerationist side of the fissure. It's perhaps a little bit ironically, because you're saying that the normal function of industrial capitalism is somehow inadequate to maximize or maximally promote technological innovation, and this extraneous factor that comes from intense military phase interstate competition provides this missing element. You know, it sort of hugely accelerates technological development, and the fact it does so is a sign that this kind of level of state involvement in armed competition between states is introducing something that normal civilian capitalism was incapable of doing itself. And so, yeah, it's an interesting thing that you could try to make the left accelerationist case against right accelerationism through this discussion of war technology and the state. And it's obviously a very small step from the notion of the Promethean state to the notion of the kind of heroic military and, you know, without wanting to be too crass about it, but fascist state. It seems that you can make that transition fairly smoothly.
Yeah, which is maybe the most important, or the most like practically salient upshot of the discussion is, you know, how thin that line and how related to developments in you know, military civilian relations and military capitalist relations are to sort of like how this will go. You know, maybe the question is like, or if the real version of my earlier question then is like, what is the next path dependency? That maybe that is the thing to be looking to. But I wanted to say there's an interesting, you know, because Girard has been so important, but there's a definite like sacrifice mimesis sort of thing going on here, where, you know, you have this enormous sacrifice of like normal commercial activity, end of life and things like that, and then you see this sort of process of technology originating. I don't quite have the sort of structure of mimesis down, but like the production of technology that, you know, imitates death or something based on it, and then spreads into other usages outside in the wake. I mean, my favorite example is neuroscience. There's this great book about the sort of history of major discoveries, early discoveries in neuroscience. And this guy makes the point that it has like that every time it advances, it's because you had some horrible injury that was unprecedented. And
right.
to study it. And so like the idea of the notion of a phantom limb is noticed in the Civil War because it was the first time amputees like regularly lived, and the ammunition used in it like shredded people's limbs. It was still the deadliest. I mean, I may have said this in a previous class and talked about this, but the deadliest ammunition ever used. And then like in World War II, PTSD, and you know, this whole behaviorist psychology, arguably, you know, is made into World War II, and that.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, also like we could bring in the distinction between a market economy as such.
So sorry, Hunter, I missed the grammar of that, and I wasn't expecting it to finish quite so soon. Can you just repeat the question? Sorry.
He must have dropped down.
Hunter, I don't know if we can hear you right now. Do you want to type it in the sidebar and one of us can read it? There's this very cryptic music coming from somewhere. I'm going to do some music.
That's
Right.
my background to the class. Sorry, dark ambient. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole. Sorry, there's a lot going on in the subject, so it's hard to keep up. I can see that there's a whole thread from Adam that I think is pretty interesting about this, to do with emergence versus managerialism in these things, which I do think traps a lot of these tensions very interestingly, and obviously
I mean, I was just trying to find some terms that didn't carry the same sort of baggage as left and right as a starting point, right? So if you would put Thiel on the managerial side in this case, because he seems to say that, okay, you need that, you know, drop that push to get over the next, you know, bit of stagnation or whatever. And you put Alexander Hamilton and, you know, Lee Kuan Yew and, you know, probably Nick Srnicek all in the same weird looking team that way, versus like the importance of emergence or just that, you know, the degree to which it can be driven with an executive sort of approach, essentially.
Yes, totally agree. I think there is this kind of role of the hero, isn't there, in that as I think we've agreed is a weird sort of resonance between Thiel and left accelerationism. I mean, I'm hoping it doesn't sound. I hope we've got beyond the point where that seems like an unfair thing. I mean, that Prometheus is the figure of the hero. So I mean, whether or not one's talking about a specific individual, one's talking at least about a heroic process that is to be contrasted with this kind of anonymous, emergent processing of information by the market or by these catalactic processes, distributed learning systems, which totally lacks, and in fact, you know, philosophically generates itself by systematically eliminating the heroic element. You know, I think the heroic element is the transcendent element in a certain construction of this, you know, and you have a kind of critical responsibility to traverse the circuit and de-heroize it in order to kind of melt these points of kind of Promethean vitality back down into these distributed processes of emergence. And obviously Thiel goes the other way with that for sure. Yes.
If someone wants to talk about Luddism now, it seems super relevant. You know, because I know some of this stuff about Ludd not being anti-technology as such, but more worried about the social conditions of the workers and so on. So, you know, Vince or Joshua who know a bit more about it, more weigh in and try and connect it. That would be kind of cool.
You should prod Vincent. He's got something on the sidebar that definitely suggests he has some cogent remarks on Ludd and Luddism to make.
Could you repeat the question?
I was just seeing the stuff in the sidebar that you and Joshua were putting in there, and it seems like a rich thread. So it would be interesting to hear.
I know. I mean, it's just a general point about Luddism that I think it's important. And I mean, my background is as a historian, so I tend to be kind of obsessed about being rigorous about history. The way that people talk about Luddism often doesn't bear that much resemblance to what it actually was as a historical phenomenon. And Stephen Jones has this great book, Against Technology, where he actually traces it historically, how it turned into this image that the original political movement became kind of unmoored from its historical reality and then became this kind of middle class romantic image of smashing technology, of kind of practical decelerationism almost, which the original kind of workers' Luddist movement wasn't really about. It was about kind of protesting specifically people being made unemployed by technology, but also wanting kind of to repurpose the new technology for their own purposes for the workers, which is a kind of left accelerationism almost 200 years before the letter, right?
Right, sure.
So it's just weird. I mean, I don't know if you know this person on Twitter, Uriello, he made a point about this. He said the fact that Luddism isn't actually what people think Luddism is shows that there's never actually been a serious kind of coherent decelerationist political movement in this sense, because people ultimately don't want to just smash technology, you know.
I would actually say, sorry, Nick, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's fine, for sure. Zach, go ahead, yeah.
Just when Vincent said this, it jogged in memory that there's never been kind of a decelerationist Luddite movement. This is a bit obscure, or maybe among this group it's not obscure, but I think like 10 years ago, this French collective called Tiqqun, Tiqqun, published a piece called I think it was the cybernetic hypothesis or something like that.
Really, a brilliant piece. It was so good, I thought.
It was a really stimulating bit of writing, but kind of fundamental to their praxis. Basically, it was this almost Luddite type of argument framed within cybernetics. And before I say anything intelligent about it, I'd have to go back and read it. But one of the pieces that stuck with me was like they basically recommend throwing noise into the system. So like basically scramble signal type of feedback processing. I think ultimately, like some of them maybe even acted on it, like they got busted for screwing with train schedules or something crazy like that. I don't really know where it was going, but it does seem like a modern day kind of cybernetic Luddite type of movement. If anybody wants to pick up that piece, it's kind of fun.
Yeah, I mean, Ted Kaczynski is obviously the example. I mean, I guess clearly not a movement. It's the fact that he has to act purely through this kind of Dada terrorism is a sign that he lacks a movement. But the program definitely seems unambiguously decelerationist, doesn't it? I forget the first sentence, whatever, industrial civilization has been a disaster for the planet and for mankind, or something of that kind. He completely is clear that he's against it. But I mean, sorry if this seems a bit of a digression, but is there any chance of getting a bit more about what the actually historically real Luddite program was? Like when Vincent, you're saying that they wanted to repurpose technology for the workers. Well, is there anything that you can say to flesh that out a little bit, or am I asking for too much?
I think you'd probably have to go back to the book I recommended, because it's not my historical field. But
yeah, sure.
I think the point that Stephen Jones makes is that if you look at what the Luddites actually were doing, I mean, they didn't really have much of a coherent program that we know of, because I mean they were workers. They didn't generally have this kind of access to printing, literature and so on. But they had very kind of a tactical kind of approach. They didn't just smash technology willy-nilly. They made specific points with the things that they destroyed. Like we destroyed this particular mill or whatever because it's unemploying however many people, but we'll leave alone these other things which have been kind of integrated and which haven't made people kind of unemployed. That kind of trying to get them to implement technology in a way that serves them rather than just kind of profit.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it's difficult for me, this, because I'm probably just being kind of paleo-Marxist in taking this line, that the only really solid index of whether this technology is industrially useful is if it's making people unemployed.
Oh, I agree.
And so it must have been, I mean, the technology they left alone, I'm assuming either they were misconstruing its function or it was in some sense intrinsically dysfunctional. But in either ways, that if they just followed the program that you're saying, they would necessarily be focusing on taking out the crucial links and doing and optimizing the actual frustration of technological industrial development. If you just say, look, we're just gonna smash the machines that are most dramatically throwing people out of work, then you would actually going to be smashing the machines that are really working.
No, I think so. I mean, this is kind of one of Marx's critiques against utopian socialism in a way, and the Luddites were a kind of utopian socialist movement. I guess it's just important to separate that, and then maybe you can ask whether this presents problems with left accelerationism, but separate that from the kind of radical decelerationist kind of impetus, which I guess you can identify maybe with things like some forms of Heideggerianism or whatever, which is something which is very different, in my opinion.
Right. Sure. Yeah. I mean, do you think it's fair to summarize that as just saying that Luddism was essentially tactical?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know what James's comment here fits in. I mean, I just can't even make sense of this. I mean, I don't know whether anyone else can. James got this thing, says, they, the Luddites, confine their attacks to manufacturers who use machines in what they called, quote, a fraudulent and deceitful manner, end quote, to get around standard labor practices. I mean, what does that mean other than just simply that effectively made people unemployed by automating industrial processes? Right, okay. So the Luddites' theory was just that machines shouldn't substitute for labor, but should increase the quality of craft output.
Yeah.
Well, and that issue of apprenticeships specifically is interesting because, I mean, I look at that and the one thing that stands out as like, no way that was ever going to happen is apprenticeships required in order to run machines. And then that's that issue of like, you know, human know-how or human capabilities and substitution. So there's like, not only if, you know, if machines are producing substitutions for various aspects of human behavior, then like in that light, you could look at capitalism as replacing or using that to replace the system of human knowledge transmission, you know, itself, to machinize it by making simpler and easier, you know, things to use. And so the worker becomes, you know, proletarianized in Stiegler's terms, which is another, you know, sacrifice mimesis dynamic, because if you know, it's like a use it or lose it thing.
Yes, totally. Totally, and Thiel in 0 to 1 does have remarks that do connect with that quite interestingly. Like he's got some very interesting remarks about restaurants, you know, which he says that it's a kind of super competitive industry. It's generally kind of self-imposed, as many scare quotes as you want, exploitation, but it's a stunning level of exploitation in terms of people's working hours, low wages, low profitability of those businesses, you know, and he's saying this is just like what a competitive marketplace looks like. It just screws everyone except, in a certain sense, the consumers of that business. And so that does seem to kind of weirdly, yeah, as you say, there's a bridge there between the Luddites are wanting a non-market driven mass consumerist model for technological absorption.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's interesting to like bring up restaurants like at this particular juncture in economic history, because like, I mean, I have a fair amount of experience working in them as like, you know, one of those people. And you know, it's just interesting that it's almost the last industry, like really widespread industry left, it seems like, at least here, but I think, you know, a lot of other places too, that's kind of like piratical, you know, like if you know how to like serve or bartend or something like that, like you can live off of that and no more. You can always find work, like, and anybody can do it. You know, you could have murdered somebody and you can work in a restaurant, et cetera, et cetera. And then right around now, I think we're in this place where like Uber for food models combined with the fact that, I mean, I've heard from a number of people that the feds are just done with servers not paying taxes, or, you know, like taxation on tips like not really happening, and that that's about to come to an end, like server wage and things like that in the next few years. And I think those things together, you know, I mean, like has the potential to just sort of like radically destroy this sort of existing replicative, hyper-competitive, piratical thing and replace it with something like much like lower personnel, much more algorithmic, and, you know, and I think there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs there. Like I understand his argument, but like there's definitely a benefit from having a thing like restaurants. And I guess it's interesting to ask like what the next version is. Like where does the precariat go?
Well, when you say Uber for food, how developed is that model? Is it something that's kind of implemented in terms of companies in some serious way? Yeah. In
New York, just like in the last 6 months, I guess, is something called MealPal went public, which has like, you know, I don't know, 200 something participating restaurants in Manhattan. And it's like you pay for a certain number of meals a month and they release like a menu of one item from all of these places the night before, and you like order and then you just like go and pick it up, you skip the line, all of that sort of thing. And it's a flat $6, you know, is what each of the meals is worth. And I think once you combine that model with like automated delivery courier service, like whatever it is, which is also happening with like other, you know, widespread apps like Seamless and so forth. And you know, even to the point of self-driving cars, you have a point where like all you need is a kitchen, right? It's more a matter of kitchens all over the city pumping out food that goes in all different directions, rather than, you know, like serve the restaurant as a model. I think starts to like decay away. Is just what I would.
So it's basically to do with eliminating physical restaurant space, is it? And restructure the whole industry increasingly as a delivery service. Is that the core of the model, or am I missing the?
Yeah, no. It definitely is, and I think it's also definitely driven by, you know, rising rent and real estate prices and so forth, like in different. And so it's definitely, you know, there's a city aspect to it. Like obviously this doesn't work so well in the Midwest, but I mean, how big is the restaurant industry in the Midwest anyway, given population?
Right.
Yeah, I don't know where that goes in terms of flowing back into our argument, but it's definitely an interesting moment for that particular industry's relationship to, you know, technological acceleration and all this stuff.
Yes. Yes, it is interesting.
So, hello, Nick. Sorry, guys. I'm just going to interject for a second and say that we were eavesdropping on you here in Athens. I'm at the art institution called the State of Concept, and I did a bit of a presentation on what New Center is about, and I went over the whole Nick Lang controversy a little bit. And sorry for interrupting you, but we did we did not judge you, and we did not kind of like anything. We just watched like 10 minutes of the class, and thanks for letting us in. Thank you, Theodore, for letting us in. Oh, that's
so Mo, what time is it in Athens?
What time is it in Athens? It's 7 p.m.
Oh, that's a nice, comfortable time. Yes. Good.
What time is it in Shanghai?
Just gone midnight.
Midnight. Okay. So please don't corrupt the mind of these young, innocent people there. Okay. And I hope they give you enough challenges to make it all worth. I'm gonna
always, yes.
And hopefully we get to talk privately about the business of the new center at some point.
Okay, sure, yeah. Have fun.
See you guys later. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Makes you think.
Is that an official New Center no comment?
No.
That was a very fast reply, Theo.
Don't get Theo into trouble. So yeah, maybe where do you think we're at? I think.
Oh yeah, we're actually 5 minutes to the end time, but we can go over if people like.
Oh, are we? Okay, well, whatever, guys. I'm not. Yeah, that wasn't what I meant. Was more just like, is the restaurant discussion on a glide path, or are we? Do we need to do a kind of rejolt?
If we want to rejolt, there's a question I had that I tried to ask before I cut out.
Okay, great. Yes, do. Sorry that you cut out.
So it was about the distinction between private enterprise as such and private enterprise or market economy as such, and a market economy that's driven by consumer desires. So like one can imagine a state that encourages competition for government contracts for massive spending on technology, and like disincentivizing maybe by means of high taxation, orientation of enterprise towards consumers. And so it seems like in the MAP, part of the issue is the fact that we keep making more and more like gadgets that like people think they want without investing in enterprise in sort of a more fundamental way. And so yeah, I wanted to bring up that sort of between, like, you can have a market and competition, but that there's sort of the whole like consumer fantasy field.
Right. That is because, again, interestingly, I do think Thiel has this point of resonance with this, where he says, sorry, just give me 1 second. Damn, hang on, sorry, 1 second. I think I'll have to just search. Yeah, here we go. So he says, the economic decoupling of computers from everything else leads to more questions than answers and barely hints at the strange future where today's trends simply continue. Would supercomputers become powerful engines for the miraculous creation of wholly new forms of economic value? Obviously, this is what he likes. Or would they simply become powerful weapons for reshuffling existing structures for nature red in tooth and claw? So this is his, mimetic rivalry. More simply, how does one measure the difference between progress and mere change? How much is there of each? Now, it's not that he's exactly a left accelerationist, if that really needs to be emphasized, but there obviously is kind of massive resonance between their rhetoric and Thiel's rhetoric in that paragraph, isn't there? I mean, it just seems shockingly close, and exactly in the area that Hunter's pointing to. I mean, this, would they simply become powerful weapons for reshuffling existing structure? I think you could almost cut and paste, this paragraph into the MAP, and it would be invisible. I mean, it would so just smooth into the language of that text that it would not be visible that you'd crossed a transition there. I mean, Hunter, please come back if you think I'm dropping the key to the point that you're wanting to make there.
Well, I kind of go with. I mean, so when is? I mean, there's this. We were talking before about, where would the money need to come from, or like, how could you have a universal basic income and also have massive government spending on technological innovation? And I think the point I was making, or the question I was trying to point to, was sort of shifting the topic to whether capitalist enterprise feeds like consumers' sort of imaginations and fantasies, which is maybe not the most rational way for it to produce, but that like you could have maybe a universal basic income and then incentivize companies to produce these sort of larger industrial projects rather than be addressed to like the individual consumer. So
But are you saying that there is some centralized mechanism that decides on the difference between essential and frivolous consumption that would substitute for the marketplace as the milieu for that decision?
Well, maybe like the consumers in the marketplace would actually be states.
They would be, sorry, I missed the last word. Would be what?
Like states. Like it would be like contracts for large projects. Like does that not make any sense?
Well, it's sort of, I don't know. I think there's several different things going on at the same time. Like because your starting point is this whole thing about frivolous consumerism, isn't it? It's like the system generates these desires that from some vantage point is to be kind of derided. You know, that both left accelerationism and Thiel are deriding it from their different points of view. You know, Thiel's just saying it's mere change as opposed to progress, that, you know, he's seeing it as, in some sense, this kind of this degenerate form of production. And obviously there's this kind of complementary critique of kind of facile consumerism on the left acceleration side. Obviously I've got a problem with just, well, where's the criterion for that distinction to be made? I mean, you know, I can't believe Thiel is suggesting that you're going to have a government bureau deciding the difference between, you know, what is actually valuable and worthless consumer desire. But I'm assuming the left accelerationists need something like that. They need some kind of political body that's going to be able to sort of sift out good and bad modes of consumer satisfaction, aren't they? Or isn't the criticism completely empty if there's not a kind of possible practical response to it?
And wouldn't they also have to argue that, you know, kind of this frivolity, I mean, in some sense, anything outside of basic survival, you know, you could almost define as frivolity, but in fulfilling those needs, I mean, that is actually what drives a lot of technological progress, you know, versus trying to solve like these hard science and computational problems for their own sake. I mean, most of them have been basically knocked out over the decades as, you know, ways to streamline business operations for, like, I mean, the most mundane things, like all the innovations in logistics, right, IT, etc. It's emerged out of that.
Yes, that's a good point. That you can have radical transformation of business processes with a completely arbitrary product. So the quality of the product needn't actually be relevant at all to the quality of the industrial advance that is associated with it. I mean, I don't know. This is a kind of I think it's a very foggy, because it's such an essential point, really. Like, you know, it's easy to deride the outcomes of consumerist preference, and Peter Thiel does that in one way, and the left accelerationist does it in another way. But, you know, what actually is the alternative model that is being suggested for that? And I don't really see one. I mean, Thiel has one of a kind, which is that you don't try to change the consumer, the structure of consumer desire, except by, in this heroic entrepreneurial way, bringing something totally new onto the market, and then thus, I assume, like displacing some significant chunk of what was there before. I'm much less clear what this more straightforwardly left accelerationist solution is to that problem.
Isn't this the same sort of problem of trying to measure the alleged stagnation in the first place? Because I mean, how do you decide whether there has been stagnation?
Yes.
I mean, you know, Theo has his, you know, what was it? We wanted flying cars, but we got 140 characters or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's sort of putting it within a certain sort of value system of you know, this kind of promoting this kind of business is good. You know, flying cars good. You know, Twitter, social media useless.
Yes.
But you know, according to what? I mean, I don't know whether, because are we all agreed that there is a stagnation? I'm not. It surely.
Well, I think this is a fantastic question, really good, and Thiel asks a version of it himself. I mean, there is a response that just sidesteps it, which I'll make just to get it out of the way more than to derail what I think is your really good question, which is that you just turn to income stagnation as the bottom line. I mean, the fact that I think there is this great stagnation discourse because wages in America have been flat now for decades or whatever. There's just this collapse of the basic sort of upward path of wages in America that I think is the kind of clunky bottom line of that avoids difficult value judgments. But I think that your question is absolutely right, and I agree. I think Thiel, you know, just to take him, but I think, you know, without wanting to over egg the pudding on this, I think that there are these resonances between Thiel and the left accelerationists on this kind of thing, and for sure he is utterly dismissive, and Cohen too, in a way, of the internet, of all of the consumer surplus that have come out of the internet. He thinks is basically, you know, of marginal value compared to these previous waves of technological progress, which is, I would have thought, weird. But that's just me, I guess. Not just me, but
yeah, it does seem weirdly myopic, you know, like sort of like hypnotized by the smartphone era, or the first smartphone era, where it's all, you know, attentional costs, but very little attentional, like gain and attentional mechanisms. You know, because I mean, obviously the enormous promise of this is the ability to amplify cognitive activity. And since that's mostly not been what's happening, because, you know, you hand a monkey a phone, you know, it's going to play Pop the Balloon or whatever those stupid games are. But like that, you know, doesn't necessarily last with like machine learning and personal analytics and smart assistants and stuff like that. That could change pretty quickly.
Yes. I mean, I'm hoping. Sorry, Hunter.
I was just going to.
Oh, sorry, Vincent.
I was going to say that the statistics on this technological stagnation. I mean, I've tried to find quantitative evidence for it, and it's pretty hard to. I mean, for instance, the US research budget as a percentage of the total federal budget has actually, I mean, it's been about the same for the last almost 40 years now. So that hasn't really changed very much. The only thing that might have changed is that there's been somewhat less government investment in very large research facilities.
Right.
So there might be a stagnation there, but I'm not convinced that there's statistical evidence for a general technological stagnation, or that the state has somehow relinquished its entrepreneurial role. I don't know.
I think there's a whole cluster of different questions there, all of interesting, but they're sort of detachable. Like, you know, on the one hand, there's this question about the role of the state, which you end up with on the question, and you know, government infrastructural spending and primary research. But Thiel, I know, taking it in the other direction, he thinks that scientific productivity has fallen off a cliff. I wish I could remember where this was. Maybe other people who've been looking at this stuff recently can remember. But I think he thinks that there's been like a 2 or more orders of decimal magnitude collapse of scientific productivity in the United States. So, you know, irrespective, I mean, just hypothetically, let's say there's something to that, it would make trying to use budget figures as a valuable metric here completely hopeless.
Yeah, I mean, Vince is definitely right to say it's not all a settled question. But there is a fair bit of evidence and there is a fair bit of discussion in the economics profession around why are we in this low growth state and how do we get out of it, right? There's a lot of very engaged mainstream economists in that, and it's not purely about income stagnation, it's also about very low GDP growth. There is empirical evidence of dropped investment by private companies in the US, like not actually as much reinvestment going on. So using the ATM of the stock market. And, you know, there's these discussions about secular stagnation and so on. There's a whole 6 or 7 reasons. Is it a kind of long debt hangover where when you have, you know, a recession or depression caused by, you know, the end of a debt bubble, that causes a permanent, you know, multi-decade difference in behavior in the market, that there's a whole argument about Japan and whether that's what the US is going through, where you're saving more instead of investing more. I mean, that's very current in the economics profession, but it's not a settled question, basically because it's so hard to measure all of these things all of the time.
Could I interrupt here in respect to Thiel in particular? Because it seems to me that a lot of the things that quantitatively do represent kind of obvious stagnation in some sense, particularly the fall in global trade, which has been measured over the last kind of 2 years, which is basically unprecedented. That's not actually a problem for Thiel, because Thiel sees globalization as such as just a kind of multiplicative process, which isn't really, it doesn't represent substantive progress for him. Right. So in a weird way, the stuff that we can actually measure as being some kind of economic stagnation, for Thiel, that's just a kind of impetus. That's not the thing that he sees as the problem, I think. So the question then becomes, what is the problem and how can we really measure this, which I don't think has necessarily been answered very well.
No, it's still, and it is a really difficult, serious question, because all your obvious metrics end up being in some way questionable. Like, let's say, like Adam saying, you go to business investment, but business investment is not really telling you anything unless you know how productive that investment is being. You can be in a stagnationary state that is absorbing huge amounts of business investment and producing a really low return on it. You know, it's not actually part of some explosive techno-economic dynamic. So you know, even when you think you've got a fairly solid economic criterion, it tends to kind of pour out between your fingers, I think, in this question a lot. And on the other side, you know, notoriously, the internet is just bad at monetizing itself. You know, people, it's very hard to actually get positive revenue flow from an internet business. But the amount of consumer utility of the internet is obviously completely disengaged from that. You know, so people just are, in terms of the amount of internet content they're consuming every day, is utterly vast. You know, as a sort of anthropological transformation, it's almost without precedent. You know, people just constantly plugged into their mobile phones. This is what their life is, just, you know, 8 hours a day of internet immersion. The fact that you can't put a monetary figure on that, it seems a bit of a leap to then say, well, what's being produced? I mean, what's being produced is this massive transformation in the basic functioning of the human organism. It's almost, you know, comparable only with the emergence of mass literacy or something.
You can also bring it back to Marx's argument about the rate of profit, because Marx argues that it's actually where the moments where it becomes most difficult to get profit, that's when you find the kind of highest speed of innovation.
Right.
And the internet might be something like that.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I mean, it's a standard thing of subsequent wave theory too, that the trough is the period of technological innovation, because all the resources that are required for technological development are crash in price, are devalued. You know, as a kind of industrial environment, it's vastly superior to the kind of highly inflated boom era time where, you know, money is expensive, equipment, plant is expensive, labor is expensive, everything costs a lot, and so it's a very difficult time to innovate. Whereas you kind of bottom feeding in a trough, you can do all kinds of stuff really cheaply. And I think, I mean, that sounds just like a theory, but I think when you sort of track when these waves of innovations happen, they tend to be much more markedly trough phenomena than peak phenomena.
For the last several decades, that's absolutely true, like empirically. Corporate profits, you know, kind of following like those early IT innovations in the 70s and 80s, they spiked during the 90s. There was a further kind of spike in corporate profits, actually, like just right after the financial crisis. I think probably as they laid off like zero marginal product workers and things like that.
Yeah.
So in terms of like Thiel's sort of really negative opinion of scientific productivity recently, is that just like an across the board thing? Does he include like biology and biotechnology in that? Or is it just like, I mean, physics, it's kind of inarguable or long-standing, but
yeah.
Okay, does he have comments specifically on biotechnology? Like he sort of just blew past it in the interview that I was reading.
Yes, I think he blows past it a bit, but I think as a venture capitalist, he just feels that he's got a pretty good sense of the companies that you can stick money into, and that biotech plays are just not very, you know, there's just not a big asset class there, you know. So I think just he's coming from the place of someone who wants to stick money into exciting, potentially profitable technological businesses, and is just finding it hard to find stuff to invest in.
Right. Okay, so, I got you. Do you buy into the sort of spreading sort of conspiracy theory worry that, I mean, you know, that China is going to be so ahead on using CRISPR because of like a greater ability to relax ethical constraints quietly as needed, you know, in terms of like developing a smarter, like a, you know, developmentally enhanced generation, like, you know, a generation or half a generation ahead of the West because of our taboos about genetic engineering? Like, do you think that there's something there?
Well, I think it's definitely at least an interesting thought, and I think obviously Thiel's argument, which he sort of doesn't emphasize, but he states it clearly enough that you can't miss it, that regulatory sclerosis is what has basically brought a lot of these things to a halt. I think the American medical field is an absolutely classic example of that. You know, the role of the FDA in just increasing the price of drugs and how much it costs to bring a new drug to market is absolutely fantastic. And so if there is going to be an epoch of regulatory arbitrage, we would see whether, you know, how much this criticism is true. I mean, I would certainly expect, I think it's surely just inevitable that if people are prepared to take more public health risks, they will accelerate the speed of innovation in these fields. And so there's a political trade-off there, which maybe different societies will weigh in different ways, about how, what you're prepared to see in terms of public hazard in exchange for highly accelerated innovation. I think there's again an assumption in lots of societies up to this point, under the kind of American example, that basically people will pay almost anything to squeeze out some marginal residue of social risk, that there's just simply no level of social risk that is ultimately acceptable, public health risk or whatever, in transport risk or whatever field you're talking about. That seems to me just simply economically impossible. And I don't think there's a very good price discovery system for that at the moment.
Okay, and then so the implication then from sort of like an NRX angle is that because that is an inevitable feature of large collective decision-making processes, with regards to this risk acceleration trade-off, that democracies are at a fundamental sort of like inimitable disadvantage relative potentially to other state formations, because they'll always make the risk-averse collective choice.
I don't know. That's an interesting suggestion, and it's definitely not one that I would immediately be inclined to resist. I mean, it's not necessarily clear that, for instance, there are on one level the issue is about sensitivity to public pressure, and that is not restricted to democracies, obviously. The thing that would really limit it is regime diversity. So I mean, if people with deep misgivings about the public policy of their own society felt extremely mobile and are able to go into a kind of jurisdiction that better reflected their own balance of a preference vis-a-vis the innovation security trade-off, then there would be less pressure on those regimes willing to kind of set the bar high in the innovation direction to moderate their policy stance. So I mean, I'm just saying I would put much more weight on regime diversity than any particular kind of internal regime structure in this respect. I think, for instance, China, being the size it is likely to be an inhibition in itself, and you're likely to see much more kind of turbo growth in these things in the smaller satellites in Hong Kong and off the coast, various types of special economic zones, and in the wider Sinosphere, then probably on mainland China itself.
Right, that makes sense. And maybe we're just continuing to go too far afield here, but like, how is the SEZ in Hong Kong, or I guess all of Hong Kong, is it fairly independent in terms of technological regulation? Like,
I would think very much so. It's the formal status of it is what's called a special autonomous region, an SAR. And there's a number of these SARs around. Hong Kong is obviously interesting because it's so highly functional, but I think that formally speaking, Tibet, for instance, is also an SAR. Yes, well, if James just says Hong Kong and Macau's a little bit sleepier than Hong Kong, so it doesn't get quite onto the same thing. But both of them obviously are much more turbocharged than Tibet. The Tibet category might be slightly different, but it's close. I think my first order guess is the same.
I mean, the problem now with China, though, is that the Chinese state under Xi Jinping basically doesn't like these things, because in many ways Xi Jinping is a kind of old school Maoist, and he has kind of negative opinions about what's going on in all these special economic zones. He's reasserted the need for state leadership of the economy. So I think you're probably right that the very size of China and its kind of contradictory traditions are going to be a problem in this sense.
Yeah, yeah. But there definitely is at the moment, even in the mainland, a vastly more relaxed attitude to, for instance, biotech regulation, just through the fact that there's a lack of these cultural inhibitions. There's a kind of ick factor in the West that is totally missing. You know, so you go to some biotech company in Shenzhen and they'll show you they've got miniaturized luminous pigs, you know, aren't these cute? They have no sense that you're going to say, what the hell are you doing? You know, this is an abomination against the law that I'm seeing in front of me here. You know, there's a complete lack of that cultural kind of resistance to these kind of developments. So even if there are, you know, structural factors to do with the size of the country and its degree of authoritarianism and its willingness to try and guide private industry, what's lacking is the is this kind of natural cultural disposition to be offended by these radical biotechnological innovations, I think. So, and that's got quite a lot of mileage in it in terms of what I think. There's a lot of things that Westerners think are inherently deeply controversial that would just pass without a nod in China right now.
It seems like some interesting questions fall out of this as you push that question to its limit, like the idea of risk aversion. So, in the age of autonomous capital, if it ever becomes a thing, it seems like right now the assumption within, kind of the unconstrained accelerationism is almost like, well, I don't really know how to frame it, but like basically no risk aversion, and just letting things run wild. But, for the individual entity or whatever the agent is within that system, like probably something is going to emerge just by virtue of like, to use some gambling terminology, like the Kelly criterion. If your variance as an entity is too high, you run up against a risk of ruin that might become unacceptable to you.
Right.
Yes. Just globally, how these kind of things end up playing out would be very interesting to start thinking through.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. I think maybe this is kind of almost a kind of utopian thing on my part. So I'm very open to pushback about it. But I suspect that there's a lot of global dynamics at the moment that result in the loss of a kind of implicit consensus on the natural level of tolerable risk. I kind of see it just disintegrating much more and becoming more open to price discovery, being more open to kind of regime variation and more optional. Because I think there's almost at the moment the kind of, there's certainly a way you can construct a kind of core Western socio-political tradition that leads to a notion of sort of minimalized risk as something very close to human right, where it's not even a question that someone could legitimately choose it, And so libertarians have obviously always been outliers on this, but a lot of their positions have just been so far outside the kind of ethical mainstream as to kind of be amusing to people. And it doesn't seem to me that there's any reason why that sort of construction of a kind of a very strong default to the minimization of risk that's treated as something that is really almost beyond serious question. That what is holding that together, other than a kind of transient cultural hegemony that has been sort of installed in the kind of West-directed globalization process.
I guess if that risk is minimized, it becomes indistinguishable from stagnation simply by being imperceptible or something. It can't be anticipated. It can't be felt. So I was thinking about the idea of stagnation in other registers, other than in the economic, and I don't know, just thinking about it as something that's is about the experience directly or indirectly of change. Sorry, that's more than I think I intended to say, but
no. So I think you need to say a little bit more than that.
I'm not sure I can. I guess somewhere I was thinking that the experience of stagnation might be considered as in different time frames. So rather than the geopolitical, it's linked to there's a kind of stagnation that's chronopolitical, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a very plausible thesis, but and it's a great sentence. And I'm not sure that I'm fully getting the. I partly because my brain is taking this in a certain line that I don't think is the line that you're wanting to take it down necessarily.
Okay.
So when you say that, sorry, make sure I've got it right. The experience of stagnation is chronopolitical. Is that am I quoting you right, or have I?
I think there's. I mean, I certainly said those words. Whether I said them in the same, in that.
That's the phrase.
Strung them together
Yeah.
in that way is it's probably debatable, and it's as usual a sort of once only performance. So I'm not sure that I can put them together that way again myself. I think it's you were talking about. I think you were talking about the reduction of risk, and this being linked to certainly the management of risk in the way that futurology and futures forecasting has developed has shifted its terminology to one of the kind of management of risk and its anticipation, the anticipation of risk. So I guess the point that, or the ideas that came to me or came through me or something were really about how if that becomes so imperceptible, that reduction of in the management of risk becomes so minimized or is so controlled that the stagnation becomes indistinguishable from that managed situation.
Right. Yes. And it may, you see, maybe the subtext of a lot of this and of this whole week's material is very close to that. That a whole set of social processes that just look like social risk management on uncontroversial grounds actually leads to a stagnationary social dynamic and then to a crisis, and that we're sort of in the crisis of that now. The culmination of this process that seems from a certain point of view completely uncontroversial and maybe even just simply humanitarian, of successively identifying zones of social risk and legislatively and regulatorily squeezing out that risk has led inseparably to this kind of process of economic stagnation that then triggers a political crisis of the kind that, as I say, I think Peter Thiel really captures extremely well when he says, when you have this kind of low to zero growth environment, then all political arguments become zero sum, and so they become extremely savage. So there's a kind of tragic irony to the whole thing, that you produce this extremely dangerous socio-political environment through the attempt to actually do the opposite, and to successively, to rationally, in a humanitarian fashion, eliminate social danger. I don't know whether I'm anywhere near where you were wanting to go with your chronic politics.
I think I just need to take a bit of time to think it through before next week, to be honest.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's just what I'm getting out of today, rather than anything that I can add to today.
I mean, one question is political time stagnating? Because it seems to me, from a kind of political history perspective, that actually it's almost the opposite, that it's accelerating. The whole kind of end of history liberal political structure was put in place basically to politics from developing in the direction in which it developed in the 1920s and 1930s. And so in a weird way, they kind of reset the clock back to 1900 in a weird way, and now we're starting again. So I guess you could always look at it. I mean, I don't know if this is almost some kind of sophisticated understanding of acceleration, but politics seems to be accelerating if other things are not, at least.
No, I think that's right, but I wonder how recent that is. Whether there's a, you know, phenomenon is a difficult word because it takes us in these different directions at the same time. But if you see the phenomenon of political acceleration in some kind of scientific sense as the actual process of political acceleration might be deeply rooted, but I think it's only perceived as something that is massively and terrifyingly accelerating very recently. You know, I think Trump is obviously the key symptom, but I don't think you can push it back much before then. You know, if you go back even to the beginning of 2016, it's like maybe people begin to feel something weird is happening, but it's not. There's not some strong sense, and in fact, there's another what had seemed to be the current, that is the very word neoliberalism was meant to designate, of a kind of entropic convergence of all political tendencies on a kind of neoliberal social democracy system. You know what I mean? That you'd either have a left-wing party in power that was basically focused on market reforms, or you'd have a right-wing party in power that was kind of obsessed with compassionate conservative and increasing entitlement spending. And the political spectrum had seemed to completely disappear in some respects, you know, and lots of frustration on the left and the right about that. But I think also with a great sense of impotence on both sides, of just thinking that it's nothing, you could stop this horrible sludge monster in the middle, that obviously both sides hated for different aspects of itself. And so I guess what I'm saying is that it certainly didn't look like political acceleration, like it was in fact some heat death of politics that was happening in that.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a funny story here with the kind of return of the repressed of post-war embedded liberalism, if you like, that, and in the kind of 1960s, 1950s, when people came up with this idea of populism, they basically created a set of things which they defined the liberal order against. And what's happened weirdly in the last, very recently, like you say, in the last 2 years, is that all of the things that they designated, they suddenly came together and emerged as this monster of populism, which didn't exist at the time that they designated it. They created the very thing that destroyed them, or is destroying them now. So the gates have kind of broken. The question is just, why is this happening? I suspect that there is a technological element to this in terms of technologies of political mobilization and that sort of stuff. So you could maybe say that the acceleration has kind of moved into a different sphere, and it's still a kind of techonomic process. ways in terms of politics.
Yes. It is interesting. And I think, again, Thiel is a fascinating figure like this because he is weirdly amphibious, isn't he, between these two zones. And you can have a reading of him that's predominantly libertarian economic, or you can have a reading of him that's predominantly Machiavellian political. And both of them clearly get at some substantial part of the phenomenon there.
It ties back to some extent too to like almost a measurement problem. We're talking about like, is GDP really measuring what's going on? Within the political scene, it's almost like we had this cascade in the last few years that, the dam just broke loose. But all along, if we had more, calibrated type of measurement equipment, would we perceive this acceleration or, maybe accelerationism as like a linear type of trend through time?
Right. Yes. I mean, it's interesting. What even remotely is the metric there? Because there's probably a few that people might suggest, isn't there? One that obviously comes up a lot on the right side of the discussion in particular is this whole thing about the Overton window, where there's a particular zone of acceptable political opinion that can be shifted leftwards or rightwards or in other ways modified. And so some kind of traumatic shattering of the Overton window is certainly one way of kind of describing what's happened in very recent years, I think. But I don't know whether there's a more long-term and in a way more kind of materialist metric that we can use for this process.
Well, I mean, wouldn't the fairly obvious one, like, to me at least, and this is like, it's a metric that by the very fact that it works, as a metric for what we're talking about is sort of what defines this era, and similar to what I was saying about Brexit a few weeks ago, defines its blind spot and collapse, which is like the movement of money and advertising purchases, because that's what is the last, few elections of the 90s, in this century. Yes. It's completely dictated. The election is nothing other than, like a mass advertising reality TV platform that has had more and more and more, private money circulating, yes. Especially after Citizens United, obviously. Like, that's your metric right there. So, like, what happened? A bunch of people with all of that money, instead of rent seeking, decided that they were going to blow up the ship. Yeah, I mean, like, more or less.
Well, there's that, but also, I think it takes us back to this question about the internet and measuring internet in terms of productivity, and the fact that a lot of that spending just seems to have been totally ineffective in the last cycle, doesn't it? I mean, I don't know to what extent this is the, I'm not wanting to put this as a hard fact in the sense that I'm sure there's people can dispute this, but it at least there's a narrative that the totally unexpected side of the Brexit vote and then the Trump vote was that the normal calculations of kind of efficiency of political spending had just become broken because of the internet, and all kinds of sort of to use Vincent's term, like processes of political mobilization that were happening on the internet or in these through these distributed channels were having this vastly disproportionate effect at kind of minimal cost compared to the kind of what had been seen as the kind of traditional broadcast channels or whatever.
Right. So like the money meme relationship gets
yeah, definitely. I mean, it's obviously.
I think there's also a kind.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, I think there's also a kind of Foucault point here about how when you think about technological acceleration, you also have to think about maybe the acceleration of social technologies in the sense that Foucault uses the term, as well as material technologies, if that makes sense. I don't know if it does, but.
Yes. Well, the very fact that the word meme has undergone this phase transition exactly in this period, hasn't it? I mean, you could do a lot just tracing the history of that word, but it had tended, I think, to decay, you know, and there's been some sort of papers that had been trying to discredit its kind of value as a scientific term, and you know, debunk it. And I think it was a term and sort of a process of slow eclipse, and then suddenly it becomes re-energized in this predominantly vulgar sense. I mean, I don't think most people using the word meme now are packaging into that any particularly rigorous understanding of what Dawkins and those meme theorists had wanted to put into it. But for sure, it's not become senseless. I mean, it still means something, and in certain sense means more than it ever has. Like it's become so it's become invulnerable to a certain kind of empirical criticism now, I think. If someone said, you know, memes don't exist, or, you know, memes aren't real, or memes don't really work, I mean, it would be, people would just gape with incomprehension, because it's like saying, you know, sentences don't work or something. It just doesn't, we wouldn't register with people anymore now.
Just random side note. Also, I think, you know, one of the great prophets of our era is Charlie Strauss. And I just remember, like, sort of early in Accelerando, and he talks about the internet, most of the internet having been flattened by successive semiotic jihads. Like, I mean, that is just right now in a nutshell. And you can, you know, I think as soon as, especially more like, you know, there's been a meme going around lately in the proper sense of, you know, about like doxing congressmen and doxing, you know, like corporate leaders who fund this and that. And, you know, the line between, or there's an obvious unity of that with like DDoS attacks, and like as soon as that stuff starts coming together, and it's not, the semiotic warfare is more than just talking at each other, you know, I could definitely see that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, like my inclination, guys, is to say that we've reached the end of this phase. What do you think? Maybe we can take some of this as a jump off point. I mean, my inclination was to do another kind of to roughly be in the space of stagnationism next time, but maybe this where we are now with memes, if that can be spun into something, might be a good sort of thread in specifically to next week's discussion. I'm not sure.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, we're about 20 minutes over now. So.
Is there? Does anyone have a point that they're going to just bust a blood vessel if they don't make now? Okay, I'm going to take that as compliance there. So thanks everybody, and yeah, hope to see you all next Sunday.
Sounds good. All right. Bye everyone.
Bye.